On the morning of August 1st, 1966, shots ring out from the observation deck of the clock tower on the University of Texas campus. It marks the infamous beginning of the modern era of mass shootings in America.
I'm Sarah Ferris, true crime podcaster.
And I'm Katherine Schweit, the former head of the FBI's active shooter program.
And you're listening to Stop the Killing. That is such a nice welcome. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Is everybody having a lovely time at CrimeCon? Yeah? Is it lots of repeat offenders, or have we got people that have come for the first time? Hands up. Who's the first timers? Oh, amazing. That's quite a lot. Enjoying it? Coming back. Okay, use the code Ferris. You'll get 10% off. Okay? Remember that. Remember that. So I am Sarah Ferris, and I am a true crime podcaster. If you've come down to the corner, you will see that I might need a little podcast intervention. I've got 3 true crime ones, Conning the Con, Clueless, and I've got Stop the Killing that I do with this absolute queen of a woman over here, Katherine Schweit, who is the former head of the FBI's active shooter program. And I cannot tell you how many times people have just done audible gasps when I've said that this weekend. And probably even more so after the talk that you've just done, which packed out the room. So, Katherine, I'll let you carry on and tell everyone a little bit more about you.
So I am from the Midwest, but live in Washington, D.C. area now. Oh, is that what you want? And how many pets? And
Oh, yeah, give it all. We love some animals. Yeah.
Okay, no pets. No pets because I travel a lot. Nowadays, I travel a lot to places, wonderful places like London. Actually, I was with the FBI for 20 years, finishing out in a senior executive position running the FBI's program that is trying to resolve mass shootings. And in the process, authored the FBI's first research on these types of shootings and worked with a great team of people and lots of law enforcement to work on this, but that's not really where I was trained. I was originally trained at the FBI Academy, and my first 15 years was in national security matters. So ask me a question about espionage, and I can give you some answers, because that's what I worked on prior to the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting. And when that occurred, I was plucked, as we call it, voluntold. I was walking down the corridor someplace near the director's office, and I was plucked and sent over to the White House to work on a team there with then Vice President Biden, who's now the President of the United States. So I've been working on that for the last many years. I retired because mandatory. I got kicked out in 2017, and I've continued to work in private industry, working to help companies and schools and to help people be not so afraid and realize how they can deal with gun violence and how we can reduce gun violence in the United States.
She's pretty cool. That's my summary of her. So I feel really, really lucky to have connected with Katherine, and we've been doing this podcast now. We're into our 4th season of Stop the Killing, and I'm going to let you describe it as well, just because I'm just not doing any of the heavy lifting today.
Oh, okay, good to know. You're buying the drinks later.
Yeah, standard.
Right. So Stop the Killing, it was a figment of Sarah's imagination. The title comes from actually a book that I wrote called Stop the Killing, just 2nd edition, just out, which is about how we deal with and what we know about mass shootings in the United States and around the world. But the reason that we did the podcast is Sarah and I, we were on a phone call together with somebody from California. She's in London. I live in Washington, D.C. We were on a joint call, and after the call, she contacted me and said, we should do a podcast. And I told her, I don't do podcasts.
It's true. I had to stalk her for
And so she
ages.
stalked me for a while, and she said, here's what we can do. And we made this decision to do this podcast because I said, I don't want to glorify shooters. And, I was talking to somebody asked me a question. I'm not naming names, but they're in this room. And they named a shooter. I don't name any shooters. So they're all just bad people. So in our podcast, we started with the first season was the idea of we would talk about a shooting incident. And the very first one we talk about is the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting where 20 children, 6 and 7-year-olds were killed, and 6 women that worked at the school. We started at Sandy Hook, and we talk about the shooting, and then we turn to the shooter, not to talk about the shooter, but to talk about what signs the shooter gave us that we all missed. The concept is that we'll learn the signs, not just about any shooting, but about violence. And if somebody's going to commit violence, and if they're going down a pathway to violence, how can we stop them? So the funniest part is when you listen to Sarah and I'm quizzing her. So I'll say, okay, here's what's going on. What signs were out there? And then all of a sudden there's this silence.
I edit that out.
She does. But if you listen to the first season, I don't know that as much, because the first season I think we shot completely live. That might have been, she might have re-edited it because of that.
I have. She's clearly not listened.
She might have edited out the pause, is what I'm saying. So the concept behind it is you don't get my opinion about what happened at Columbine. You get Columbine Principal Frank DeAngelis, my friend's opinion about what happened. I call up friends of mine and say, Frank, I need you on my podcast. And then Frank comes on my podcast. You get somebody who is an expert in this or that. When you want to read about international mass shootings, you would read Adam Lankford's study, or you could listen to the podcast and listen to Adam Lankford talk about Adam Lankford's study. So what we've been able to do in the podcast is bring to life people who are saving Sycamore.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite episodes.
It's 2 episodes.
It's 2 parts.
So a woman who is a middle school counselor today who talked a gun out of a hand of a young man who came in, but it took a long time. And she tells us the story. The police chief from the Aurora Theater shooting, who is a friend of mine, we still work together every day on all kinds of things. Chris Rosman, we're going to have on, you just don't know this yet, but he's the police chief at Michigan State University. There was a shooting at my university, and Chris and I have been hanging out, and I told him he's going to be on the podcast soon. He said, okay. So, surprise, season 5.
The surprise is on you because I'm just keeping season 4 running and we're doing a episode every week now. So,
oh my.
Yeah, I'm getting my pound of flesh. So, talking of pound of flesh, you've just done a guest speaker spot just before this one. How many people, can I have a show of hands, who were in the room when Katherine did that? Okay, brilliant. Excellent. You guys are going to be experts in this then. We're going to be covering myths and misinformation about mass shootings. And so you'll probably have a few ideas. So we might throw some audience questions out there. But we've also got a load of questions from people this weekend that have kindly come over to our table and written them down on what happens to be the tiniest piece of paper I could find on Amazon.
For those of you listening, they're 2 inches by 2.5 inches.
And honestly, listen, I haven't read any, so it's going to be a comedy of errors. Okay, so don't be shy. How many people have got questions left over from the last session that Katherine did that they want to answer, just so I know how much time to leave at the end?
Oh, there's questions.
Oh, we got,
They always have questions.
2. All right, excellent. 3. Oh, this feels like an auction now. Brilliant. So I want to start by sort of addressing a couple of elephants in the room.
Sure.
And these are questions that, you know, I came into this podcast with the questions that everybody has on mass shootings. First one that you hear all the time, mass shootings, just a US problem. True or false, Katherine?
False. False. Absolutely the worst shootings, the highest number of shootings are in the countries that have the highest number of guns. The United States has the highest number of guns, for sure. But other countries, plenty of other countries, and those of you know the names, Dunblane, and there's so many places. And I think our laws are so much more complicated, I swear, than they are in so many other countries. And we're a big country. We have 50 states and federal government laws, local laws, state laws, county laws. So the gun laws are so complicated that where a shooting occurs in Scotland or Ireland or here, and we have this national government system, we're just going to pass this law. You can't do that the same way in the United States. So where they passed a law in your country, New Zealand, they made changes in New Zealand, and they just did it with a swipe of a pen. Justin Trudeau is doing it, you know, and his crew is doing it in Canada. You can't do that the same way. But most mass shootings, we have the gold crown for that, but they do happen all over the world. They're just not reported in the same way. And they're not the types of shootings that you think of as school shootings.
Can you define a mass shooting in America compared to a mass shooting in another country?
So the question is, can I define a mass shooting in America versus elsewhere? So the challenge to that is that every country has its own determinations. And in the United States, The federal government, I'm going to say I'm partly responsible for this, the federal government never defined mass shootings. They've never said, this is exactly what you put in the category and exactly what you don't. So when Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting happened, I did start the FBI's active shooter program and did the first research that the FBI did. And what we count in the FBI is public shootings where an individual is actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a crowded space. So it's a broad brushed area. However, we exclude, because we know those shootings happen, but we excluded from our count is our methodology. We don't count warfare between gangs. We know what causes that. We don't count warfare between drug dealers. We don't count murder-suicides in a home, right? Because that's not out in public. What we're looking for are the threats that are out in public. That's what we think of as a mass shooting. But most mass shootings in the United States occur in the home. They are murder-suicides, they're domestic violence issues, and, gun deals gone bad and drug deals gone bad. That's what most mass shootings are. In other countries, every researcher does their own criteria, and the United States is no different. So most countries don't necessarily have a definition, but you'll hear in the news a lot, especially if you hear U.S. news, they'll say where 4 or more people have been killed. Well, that just means that's random shooting. I mean, the number of people dead does not have, to me, anything to do with the danger of the situation. And so it's a gravity issue for us at the FBI. We felt that we are going to look at any situation, and if there are 15 people injured and only 1 person killed, it's still a mass shooting. And a lot of times when you see numbers and they talk about mass shootings from the United States, they're pulling in all these shootings that are shootings in the homes and shootings in neighborhoods that have nothing to do with public shootings, but they're excluding shootings like shooting that might occur in a church where there are 15 people injured but only 1 person dead, and they don't count it as a mass shooting. So then I don't particularly support that kind of criteria. The numbers that you're seeing are often pulled off of gun violence archives, and that's just a database. It's a database. It's not based on anybody's real definition. So that's a very long answer, sorry, but just to clear that up.
On the podcast, we do actually do global shootings because the places all over that have had shootings that you wouldn't expect them to be, and we've got 2 that have been in New Zealand that are absolutely horrific. And like you say, the government swung into action in New Zealand and made some changes pretty sweepingly. But not all countries are able to make those changes. And I know that's the case in America, having done 4 seasons with you. So while you wait for the government to actually do something, the thing that I've learned the most about doing this podcast with Katherine is there's actually stuff that we can all do in our communities, and that we are the eyes, more eyes than the police, really. We're the first line of defence. So at that community level, what advice would you give to people in terms of what they should be looking out for?
So our Secret Service research and the FBI are the 2 organizations in the United States that do the most research in the area of averted attacks and trying to find shooters and what to look for. And our research absolutely shows that you in the audience are 5 times more likely to see information about a shooter than a law enforcement person ever would, because you live around them. Because what you're looking for is a typical behavior for that person. So if you are a gun owner and you've always been a gun owner, that's your typical behavior. If you are a gun owner and you shoot on Saturdays for target shooting, like I know people who do, they go out for sport shooting on a Saturday and shoot clay or pigeons, that's their typical behavior. If they suddenly, as we've seen in cases, a shooter who suddenly is shooting in their backyard every day they're shooting in the backyard. The neighbors are interviewed afterwards and they say, oh yeah, for a couple of weeks he's been shooting in his backyard every morning from like 6 to 8 o'clock every morning, and then he goes to work. I'm thinking, he's probably changing his behavior. He's probably planning something. That's a change in his behavior. If he goes and buys more weapons, if he changes his appearance, if he starts wearing, and I say he because more than 95% of our mass shooters in the United States are male, and around the world, truthfully, if he changes his behavior and he starts to dress differently than he did before. Think emo. Everybody's all in black. Well, we've all gone through those phases, I'm sure. But because we all
My
know.
favorite color.
Yeah, we look thinner.
Yeah.
So if hey, you're laughing, but it's true. You know it.
She says wearing a black pinstripe suit.
This is Bureau Black. Hey, I work for Mr. Mueller. He does not goof around.
We've all seen Men in Black. Here comes the woman in black. That's what it should be. Sorry, it's not a singing show either. I apologize.
Next, she'll do her dance. So if you have these changes to behavior, that's what you're looking for. So somebody stops taking their medication. Somebody starts taking medication they never took before. Somebody gives away their possessions. 30 to 40% of our shooters commit suicide in a mass shooting situation. And that happens. We'll do the investigation afterwards, because when a shooting happens, how any law enforcement investigates is you take the shooting incident and you work your way backwards. And what happened in the 10 minutes before, what happened in the 20 minutes before, what happened in the days before. And we go back and we interview neighbors and friends and family and check their social media sites and talk to their principals and their parents. And even when a shooter's dead and we find out, that so-and-so said, oh yeah, he came and gave me his laptop. And he said, you can have it, I'm not going to need it anymore. Hello? That's a suicide sign, right? And it might not be a mass shooting sign, but it's an indicator of suicide. So definitely the atypical actions, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And who sees those? All our research shows. Family, friends, schoolmates. In the case of the FBI's research on shootings that actually occurred, 92% of the high school age shooters or middle school age shooters, 12-year-old shooter, imagine, 92% of the students we discovered had told another student it was going to happen. 92% of the time. Talk to your kids. That's my advice. Talk to your kids. I can tell you, I was just up in Detroit, Michigan, where there was a terrible high school shooting up there. And let me tell you this about parents. 4 kids killed in the high school, Oxford High School. The kid was called to the principal's office. This is a great podcast episode. You got to hear the details, but I'm going to give you a couple of hints. The kid was called to the counselor's office because of some signs. The kid said, I was just kidding. And I can tell you that today, that kid is in jail for life. He killed 4 people. He's in jail for life, convicted of terrorism and murder. And his parents are now being tried for involuntary manslaughter. And the Michigan Supreme Court has said, yes, they can be charged. And there can be a trial for the parents because of conduct that occurred. So I know that sounds kind of like crazy. How can a parent be responsible for a kid? But the truth is they can be. And in Michigan, we're going to try the test. I mean, involuntary manslaughter is 20 years. I mean, that's a serious charge. And these parents, that shooting happened more than 2 years ago. The parents have been in jail ever since. Ever since they've been in jail.
And actually, to your point, when we did our very first episode, we did it on Sandy Hook, which was, we didn't go in soft, did we? We went straight in. I remember somebody actually saying, don't start with Sandy Hook as your first episode.
Yeah, our podcast platform said, don't do that. And I said, yeah, we're doing it.
Yeah, because people are just scared of the topic generally. But at the end of that episode, Katherine gave me some quiz questions to see what I would report. And it's astounding that even though I knew the right answer, I would still be resistant, to do it. So let me ask you this. The Sandy Hook killer actually, I think 6 months beforehand, put up across his bedroom window blackout blind, like a rubbish bag or something to cover up. And she said to me on the podcast, she said, who would have seen that? And I said, the neighbours would have seen that. And then she said, okay, well, you're his neighbour. What would you do? If I put that question to this audience now, how many people, by show of hands, would pick up the phone and report the neighbour having put a piece of blackout over the window?
Yeah, no hands for those listening. Not a surprise, right? Not a surprise.
And I think you've used the term upstanders and not bystanders, and that really stuck with me.
So I'm going to tell you, as a person who's taken those calls, I've taken a lot of those calls at the last minute where people say, hey, this is going on and this seems weird. And the thing about that is that when you make a call to law enforcement or when you make a call to the school counselor, you call somebody and say, hey, I don't know if you know this, but Jimmy was over at our house and he said X, Y, and Z, and I just wanted to tell you that. what you're doing is taking that off of your shoulders. Threat assessment teams at schools and at universities in the United States, at companies in the United States, law enforcement, all you're doing is passing a piece of information on to them. It's all a big puzzle. And they're not going to run out and arrest somebody because you randomly called and said somebody's got black curtains on his window all of a sudden.
Yeah.
They're not going to run out and say, hey, this guy's shooting in his backyard, and they're not going to run out and arrest him, but they might inquire. They might inquire, and that's what you want law enforcement to do. That's what you want a school counselor to do. If something's going on, you got to trust your instincts. I mean, we all have gut reactions to things. We have spidey senses, and so I'm always like, Sarah, just trust it, because you call and you take that burden off your shoulders.
And I always think you don't know that your little piece of the puzzle might be the last piece, and it might seem so small to you, but it might be that one sort of event that they needed, that last corner piece of the puzzle to take action, right? That
I'll
happens.
say this, not just as a FBI agent, but as a former prosecutor in Chicago. It is all those pieces, and you need those pieces. I can't get a search warrant unless I have the right pieces. And in that one piece, I mean, one phone call, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to deny it later, but I tricked somebody into giving me a signature once because I needed a handwriting exemplar. And so I kind of tricked him. His attorney said to me, that was very tricky and not nice. And I said, I don't care.
I love that.
Your client is going to jail. He was threatening people all over. He was threatening people all over the state, and in two states. And I thought we had the right guy, but I needed to see the handwriting to be sure.
Yeah.
And that was pretty funny. But I needed that handwriting exemplar in order to get the search warrant. And the search warrant gave us the search of his house, and guilty.
Job done. Job's
guilty,
a good one.
guilty. He'd been terrorizing people for 6 months, 7 months.
Wow.
You know, he was sending letters to schools and businesses saying, hi, this letter is anthrax powder and you are all dead now.
Oh.
And he was doing this, and they would be evacuating these schools and evacuating these businesses, and then he'd call in a bomb threat to wherever they evacuated. He was not a nice guy. He needed to be tricked.
I'm for it. I'm for it. So let's just start with a random, teeny little piece of yellow paper. What is the difference between, this is a gun question, between automatic and semi-automatic guns?
So automatic guns are not licensed in the United States. You can get one. It's a lot of expense, and it takes really a hard time. An automatic gun, when you pull the trigger, it continues to fire until you take your finger off the trigger. Semi-automatic rifles and handguns. I mean, it's called a semi-automatic because it means that a new round chambers in to the barrel, and the ejection port, sorry to be so specific, kicks the shell out, and then new round goes right back into the chamber so that it can be fired every trigger pull. You can pull a trigger, pull a trigger, pull a trigger, pull a trigger.
Okay. Who had an audience question? I saw some hands go up. I'll go this one. Here, go.
Yeah, Chris Summers, I'm a crime reporter. I've been to America, and I remember going to Las Vegas not long after that big Mandalay Bay shooting.
Right.
Yes.
And trying to talk to an American about gun control. They just don't get it. Like, here we had Dunblane,
Right.
and we immediately banned all handguns, and since then, we've only had 2 mass shootings, Cumbria and Plymouth. And I was saying that to an American guy, and he was just like, oh yeah, well that's, whatever. You have stabbings, like what? How is that?
Yeah, I have to say,
Streatham, we had a guy running around with a knife, stabbed 2 people and was then shot by police.
right. I have to say that
Kill that many
that's exactly why I wrote this new book called, not to plug a book, but how to talk about guns with anyone, because even the people in the United States don't know the rules about guns and the laws about guns. But the gun laws are as complicated as our legislatures are, and people are afraid to talk about guns. They don't really know the facts. They don't really know the statistics. And the question really had to do with, why won't people in the United States talk about guns? But it's because there's this very persistent view that you're either for guns or against guns, and that's the wrong answer. That's a wrong way to look at things. It's not a question of being for or against guns. Many countries have guns, and they have regulations that govern who can have the guns and how they can have the guns. But in the United States, I think it's very hard for people to have that conversation because they don't have all the facts, and because we cover these massive sensationalized coverage of shootings, and then you put a microphone in somebody's front of their face and you say, are you for guns or against guns? That's not the right question. you're really for gun regulations. What types of gun regulations are you for? Okay.
Next question. Oh, down the front here.
Katherine, you mentioned earlier about when an incident happens, you kind of work backwards.
Right.
In 10 minutes, 20 minutes, however long. What happens once you've reached the end of the investigation, particularly if the shooter has committed suicide and you can't question them? What would you do then?
The question was, well, what really happens when you do the investigation and you work your way backwards? What do you do, especially if the shooter is deceased? Well, we found in the FBI, in our initial research, that we would ask for law enforcement, we would say, hey, we see that you had this shooting that happened in your town and who knows where, and can you give us the police report? And they would say, well, the police report's 2 pages because the shooter's dead. So we have no information about what led up to the shooting. And so now law enforcement, I think, recognizes much more that even when the shooter is deceased, they need to go backwards and they need to figure out what happened that led to that shooting. And then that information is shared with other law enforcement agencies. There are after-action reports, they call them, most of them are public. I have a bunch of after-actions on my website, the Columbine after-actions on my website, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, because we learn from those how to prevent the next shooting. And that's really the purpose of doing the investigation, even when somebody's deceased. Yes, sir. So the question is, I live in Missouri. They just passed a Second Amendment preservation law, which are words they made up. I just want you to know. And the question was, is that happening across the country? What's happening across the United States right now is that there have been some court decisions that have changed laws. And I think there's been a recognition that there's a lot more of this type of violence going on and that there's things that we can do about it. So different states are siding up based on the politics of their communities. And they're also siding up in cities. So 80% of the United States population lives in suburban or urban locations, which is the largest voting blocks. And those very much often line up on one side of the politics. But the state governments, in many cases, probably half of the states, a little bit more, are run by the other side of the politics. So the state governor will sign a law that says, you can't do any of this. The legislature will pass it because it's one political party, and then the other cities, which have the majority of the people that live in the actual state, will pass a conflicting law. And so I think all of these are just going to be back and forth as there's an effort made to, I'm sorry to sound like such a lawyer, but as there's an effort, guilty, as there is an effort made to change the laws in all the states, there are certain states that think, okay, we're just going to pass something that says Second Amendment rules. Well, it's not that easy. Second Amendment is a part of the Constitution. There's so many other things that are impacted legally, and I get it. It's like sanctuary cities. We see sanctuary cities where people are saying, you can come and bring your immigrants or people who are emigrating from the country to the United States. We'll take them, they can live here, and we're not going to govern. Federal government laws aren't going to impose. Those are all going to go to the courts, and the courts are going to decide whether or not they're violative of the federal laws. And it's just going to take a dozen years for that to pass out. Yeah. So that's a great question.
Do you want to just repeat?
Yeah.
So the question was, how did you deal with the cases on an emotional level over the years that you've been working?
I'm a single mom with 2 kids, and those kids were little when I joined the FBI. One of them wasn't even potty trained, and I had to always make them a higher priority. And I think that I was fortunate because I could go home and spend time doing laundry and spend time with my kids, and that kind of normalized it. And I made decisions not to work on certain things. Like when I was a prosecutor, I shared an office with my friend Celeste, who handled what we call the dead baby cases. And, and she would have these pictures in her office of, oh my God, and you can't unsee that. And so I made a choice to not do things that I didn't want to have to not unsee. Not that that's grammatical, but I think you get the point. And I tell you, if my Tai Chi instructor was here, she would tell you all to stand up and shake and throw the bad thoughts away with your arms and stuff. So I do a lot of meditation and a lot of walking. I'm a big hiker. I mean, I'll go out and hike 10 miles or 5 miles or whatever, if I can, just because I need to get out. I need to get away. Yeah, so I hear this question. Actually, I hear this comment a lot about, I call the police, they don't do anything. Well, I get that, and you're saying here in the UK that can happen. The police will say, "Don't call and bother me with that." I get that. Okay, but I'm going to say get in trouble. All right. So first of all, I know I'm not going to. I don't want to debate it in concept, but when you get in trouble, sometimes, as John Lewis would say in the United States, it's good trouble. Okay. There's nothing wrong with getting in good trouble, and you report what you report. And the other thing is, it's not a linear. The police often can't do anything. I'm a police officer. I took a lot of calls where I just listen. I'm like, yeah, I can't really do anything about that. But you listen. That's your job. And so you take the call anyway. But also, you can report it to other places. If this person is doing something, where are they working? Where do they go to school? Are there kids living in that house that might be dangerous? Call Child Protective Services or whatever the chat fest it is here. It's not a question of I report it and they get mad at me. It's a question of if you don't report it. This is probably the most important thing you need to know about making a phone call. It isn't that you know what happened. You want to know what happened because you're curious. That is not why you're calling. You're calling because you're concerned about someone. So you have to be confident, whether you want to be or not, be confident that you're adding information to the police's knowledge about this individual. You are adding intelligence to the police's knowledge about this individual, even if we find out down the road that this person's a shooter and that 50 people called, or the police had been there 50 times. You want to be one of those 50 calls. You want to be one of those 50 calls because that's the piece of evidence that I might need for my probable cause arrest. That's the piece of evidence I might need. But also get it off your shoulders. And you know what? Let me tell you, criminals are stupid. They're so stupid in so many ways. In the United States, we have the First Amendment. You have a First Amendment right to be as stupid as you want and say whatever you want, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We used to say if we could arrest criminals because they're stupid, the whole jails would be filled. Yeah. But that's not against the law, and law enforcement can't do anything about that. But you are adding to the information that they have, even if they're reluctant to listen to you. Just don't keep them on the phone too long.
And can I add to that as well? One of the nuggets that I've heard Katherine say before is don't just tell one person. Don't just ring the police. Ring as many people as you can and play the numbers game that the pastor at your church might be the person that does something or takes action, or the teacher at the school. So,
right.
Yeah, don't just pick up the phone
Leave an anonymous tip. The United States is filled with anonymous tip lines. You probably have some of those in your country. Maybe, maybe not. But if you don't, then you call the FBI's tip line, because I can just tell you we have an international tip line. You find FBI.gov, you go find our tip line, and we'll share it.
Oh, I've used that.
That's what we do.
Yeah, I've used that. I've actually had a tip that I've had to put on the FBI tip line. And I knew that I wasn't going to get the answer, and I'm a famously impatient person. So it hurt me that I knew that I wouldn't get the actual answer. But when I step back from that, I think, where do I really want the police to be spending their resources? Is it phoning me back to tell me a satisfying answer for me, or is it to spend that resource forward?
The FBI has 56 field offices in the United States and 450 or so satellite offices, but we also have about 80 offices around the world. So if we got a call on our tip line, it's going to go out to our international office, and we're going to share it with your partners.
Well, we've got time for one more question. Oh, hot fingers at the back there. Go.
Right. Yeah, I need a translation of the last part.
Will they be forced, if the schools is a hardened target and they can't get in, will the children then be forced to go to malls? Which is,
you mean
I don't know
will the shooters be going?
Yeah.
No. So this is another big myth that I'd love to dispel right here. This idea that we're going to have gun-free zones and we're going to harden the target, and therefore the shooters are going to go into the malls and the playgrounds and stuff like that. No, I mean, that's really, the data doesn't show that. And also, there are 50 million students in the United States in schools, 50 million students. And there is just a tiny fraction of schools that are ever impacted by a shooting. Mass shootings in the United States are less than 1%, significantly less than 1% of the shootings that occur in the United States. And children, in fact, are statistically 4, 5, 6 times safer in schools than they are at home, where there are unsecured guns, where there's domestic violence, and so many other things. So children are much safer at schools. So it is not bad to harden your target, which is really what the questioner asked about things like, you know, if you put up some protections with walls and stuff. But the United States, they are not securing every school with bulletproof glass and with all kinds of magnetometers for people and things like that, because that's not practical. It's too expensive. It's more valuable for them to put another counselor in the school. And the school districts know that. Here's one of the things I encourage schools to do. Lock your doors. Lock your doors. There's nothing wrong with locking the doors of your school. And that's a really common problem that schools say, oh, it'll never happen here. I can't tell you, as an FBI agent, how many times I walked into a school wearing a gun and I walked in the back door that was unsecured. Now, schools are locking their doors. Shooters are looking for something convenient, but middle school shooters, high school shooters are coming back to their school and they have access to the school. So they do have access, and they're not running everybody through a magnetometer and every time to see whether or not they're carrying a gun. It's not practical. So it isn't a question of you're faster than the slowest person being chased by the bear. Everybody wants to be a little faster than the slowest person being chased by the bear. I get that, but there aren't that many bears in the United States. People think everybody's running around with a gun and they're just looking for a place to shoot up. And I get that that's the way it's covered in the news, but that's not really what's happening. Schools are incredibly safe in the United States, incredibly safe. And the shootings that do happen in the middle schools and high schools are current students or students who were just kicked out, current students. So the shooter's not going to go from there over to the mall because he can't get into school.
Well, I know that we are running out of time now, so I have got a little pile of tiny little yellow cards. If you've left a question for us, we will be covering it in other episodes of Stop the Killing.
Oh, yeah.
I'll be making them into bonus episodes. So please do subscribe and follow us. Katherine, if people want to find out more about the lovely Katherine Schweit, where can they go?
KatherineSchweit.com.
Brilliant.
It's not my fault. That was my ex-husband's name.
I love that. Come and follow us on Instagram. We're at Stop the Killing Stories. And if you've got more questions, you can DM us anytime and we'll make them into listener episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. If you reach out to us on the podcast, the questions that you might still have or listeners might still have, you put them out there. We do all of them.
Yeah.
She is a torturous boss.
Yeah.
And she'll call me and say, we're going to record for 5 hours on Saturday because it's 85 and beautiful where you are and you could be hiking, but now I'm going to put the headset on and saddle up to the table.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes. It's always raining in London, so bad luck. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of CrimeCon, and we'll probably see you around. Thank you
so much.
Thanks for listening. And if you want to know more, Katherine's book, Stop the Killing, is out now. For more details, go to KatherineSchweit.com. Please consider also supporting our independently made podcast. It's simple to do. Go to patreon.com/Stop the Killing. And for as little as the price of a latte a month, you can be part of the solution to stop the killing. Patreon rewards range from official do-gooder status to ad-free episodes, autographed books, and opportunities to connect with us directly for your business, school, church, or even just a book club chat. But just knowing that you are part of a movement that has the power to make your community safer, well, that's got to taste better than a skinny cappuccino any day. So please head to patreon.com/Stop the Killing now and polish off your do-gooder halo and make sure to include your name so we can give you a shout out. This podcast is a Community podcast production. That's Con with an N. If you want more content, then head over to Community Podcast at Instagram, where you'll find trailers on more binge-worthy true crime, like the award-winning podcast Conning the Con. And check out our show notes for all the links mentioned. Finally, if you want one takeaway action that you can do right now that can help make our community safer, please share, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen. Everybody needs to know that they hold the keys to see something and say something. Together, we can stop the killing.
It's one of those things you hope never happens, but you better train for it because it will happen. And it will happen in places you wouldn't expect. Be ready for it.